Thank you for joining us on our talk about vaccines today. Summit Health is one of the leading tri-states provider of primary care and specialty care, and our physicians offer dedicated and compassionate care in more than 80 locations, in more than 80 areas of medicine in 340 locations. If you ever need urgent care, you can visit our partner, CityMD, who's the leading urgent care provider in the Northeast with more than 180 locations throughout New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut.
So Summit Health and CityMD are one connected care team, and our providers work together to connect the dots between your primary care and specialty and urgent care needs. Think of your primary care doctor as the coordinator who leads your family's health team.
So my name is Dr. Abigail Grossman. I'm a board certified pediatrician, and I've been caring for children for over 25 years. Additionally, I have raised my 4 children here in New Jersey. I practice general pediatrics, and I have a special interest in education, allergy, nutrition, and behavioral health. And I see children in Fair Lawn, New Jersey.
My name is Dr. Aashiki Shah, and I'm also a board certified general pediatrician working in Clifton and Montclair. I am also a New Jersey native. In addition, I also care for newborns in the nursery at St. Barnabas Hospital. I'm a mom, and I have special interests in cultural competency and nutrition. But being a primary care physician, I'm especially excited for the opportunity to provide guidance and information about vaccinations. And I'm hoping that our presentation helps answer many vaccine-related questions and concerns.
All right, we are going to start with a poll. So here's the first question. How would you rate your understanding of vaccines for children 5 and under?
I have no knowledge, I have some basic understanding, but want to learn more, or I have a solid understanding, but I'm tuning in to learn more about Summit and connecting with a physician.
Okay, great. So it looks like Dr. Shah, people have a pretty good understanding. Excellent. Makes our job easier. All right, so we're starting with some basic stuff. So what is a vaccine? So vaccines, as many of you probably know, they're small, weakened, or dead pieces of a germ that show the body what the real germ looks like. So the immune system can create defenses called antibodies and be ready to attack if the real pathogen ever shows up. This way, the body builds immunity and can quickly fight the disease, and it prevents it from causing serious illness, hospitalization, or death before your child or you actually encounter it, right? So they are a safe and effective way of protecting your child and you against harmful diseases. They also train you to create antibodies, and they strengthen your immune system. Let's talk a little about how they save lives. They actually save over 4 million lives every single year throughout the world. In the US alone, the CDC estimates that routine childhood vaccines among children born from 1994 to 2023 have prevented over 1 million deaths in that age group. And that's about 37,000 deaths every year. They've led to a dramatic reduction in disease occurrence and deaths, and that's over 90%. In fact, the success of vaccines is so high that in many developed countries like our own, parents, healthcare providers, patients do not have any firsthand experience of these devastating diseases and the vaccines that they prevent. All right, briefly, as most of you probably know, vaccines are mostly given by injection. There are a few that are given orally, and there's even a flu shot that's given in the nose. Vaccines in general, as we know, are controlled and predictable and really much safer than having the long-term effects of actually getting the disease. So right now we're going to dive into specific vaccine recommendations, and Dr. Shah is going to discuss recommendations for vaccines for expectant parents.
So before we even discuss the vaccines that are typically recommended in children, I want to talk a little bit about the vaccines recommended in the expectant mom. The first one is Tdap, and it protects against tetanus, diphtheria, acellular pertussis, and this vaccine is usually recommended in the third trimester between 27 to 36 weeks, and this is with every single pregnancy. This vaccine is especially important because it basically optimizes mom's antibody response, allowing protection to the developing fetus and eventually the newborn. And this way, infants are protected before they start to receive their own series, which is called DTaP, and that typically starts at 2 months of age. Now, pertussis is highly contagious. It's commonly known as the whooping cough. Babies under 1 year of age are actually at the highest risk. And the vaccination is especially important because it can put babies at risk for dehydration, vomiting, even temporary pauses in breathing known as apnea, which can lead to hospitalization. To date, there are still infants who are unfortunately dying from this illness, which is entirely preventable. In 2024, we had 6 deaths, 526 hospitalization in infants under 6 months of age. Now, this is a lot for an illness that we can actually prevent just by getting the vaccine. So the protection starts early, and that's for the expectant mom. The next one is the influenza or the flu vaccine. And this is actually acceptable in any trimester to reduce the risk of flu as well as its complications. And infants are not eligible until 6 months of life. So by providing the vaccine to the mom, you're actually protecting the baby as well until they're ready to get their own flu vaccine, especially if they're going to be born in their first fall and winter season and they're going to be under 6 months of age. The next one is the COVID-19 vaccine, and this can also be given at any point in the pregnancy. And, this is important because as moms are expecting, they are considered technically immunocompromised, which means that they're at higher risk of getting infections. So it's crucial that we can actually provide this protection for both mom and baby. And generally, moms who get COVID-19 infection, we know have a higher risk of respiratory issues, heart damage, blood clots, kidney damage. And the infants themselves actually also are at risk of suffering certain consequences if they were to get the infection, including growth restriction, premature delivery, as well as even stillbirth. So, we have an abundant amount of data which supports that this vaccine is safe and effective. So the protection, really does start very, very early. And the last one is the RSV vaccine, so respiratory syncytial virus. And this is a virus that Dr. Grossman will touch more about during her part of the presentation. But, this virus has gained a lot of attention in the news over the last couple of years. We do know that it can cause serious lung infections, especially in young babies and children. And in fact, there are usually between 60 to 80,000 hospitalizations every year in the US. For the mom, she can obtain the injection during the third trimester, and this will allow for passive immunity transfer to the baby. So the baby will actually have antibodies and have some protection before getting, the exposure, the possible exposure for that first fall and winter season. Now, back in 2024 and 2025, after the RSV vaccine was made available, data actually shows a significant reduction in infant hospitalizations compared to pre-vaccine years. So we do know that the vaccine has been extremely effective so far. And just a last note about the spouse, any close contacts who will be around the baby. This includes adult family members as well as young children. Now, the Tdap is recommended for all individuals who will be around the baby, especially if they have not been vaccinated within the last 10 years. And this will actually protect the baby importantly for pertussis. The other one that's also recommended is flu and COVID, and any younger children who will be around the baby should also be fully immunized in accordance with the AAP guidelines to allow maximal protection.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Shah. That was really informative. All right, so this slide is of the entire vaccine schedule for 2025. You have to really squint your eyes to see it. It is a very overwhelming slide. But we did want to just show you everything so you see what we look at every year. This comes out every year and it changes a little bit. So why is it so important for young children to get vaccines so early in life? We're going to reiterate this point sort of over and over. It's because infants have an immature immune system and they actually do have limited protection from the maternal antibodies that, Dr. Shah alluded to. So therefore, they are at really high risk for severe life-threatening infections. And that's why they receive the most vaccines during their first year of life. This is when they're most vulnerable to the consequences of all these invasive bacterial infections that we're going to be discussing also in more depth in a few minutes. Um, this slide also shows the timing. There's a timing that's recommended in this vaccine schedule, and it takes into account the timing of the decreasing maternal antibodies and also how the infant's immune system develop. It also takes into account the susceptibility of disease and the effectiveness and the dosing of the vaccines. Really importantly, vaccines on the schedule have been tested in the final formulations and with other vaccines given at the same time. So it's really non-scientific when one delays or separates the vaccines and puts infants really at unnecessary risk with no true safety concern. All right, so we're going to begin with the vaccines that we give as newborns. The two that are recommended as newborns, as you can see up here, hepatitis B and RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, as Dr. Shah just described. So hepatitis B, this has been a very hot topic in the news over the past couple weeks, I believe. I'm sure people are very confused. They have a lot of questions. So the big question is, why do newborns need this vaccine and why do they need it so early in life? So here's the rundown. Hepatitis B is a virus and it causes very serious liver problems. There are actually about 1 to 2 million people in the United States that are living with chronic hepatitis B infection. If an infant gets hepatitis B at birth, up to 90% of them, 90, will develop chronic liver disease. This is compared to only 5 to 10% of adults that are exposed. This is why the vaccine is given so early. Early in life, newborns are at the highest risk. Over time, what happens if you get hepatitis B, chronic hepatitis B infection? Obviously, it causes liver damage, liver cancer, liver failure, and even death. In fact, 25% of babies who develop chronic hepatitis B will die from liver disease. So this birth dose is so important. And it's important because parents may not even realize that they're infected with the disease. So how do you get this? You get it through, you get hepatitis B through blood and body fluids. And of course, babies get it around the time of birth. But that's not the only way it's transmitted. So people say, well, why not just give the vaccine to high-risk moms? Because people don't even realize they're infected. About 30% of people who have hepatitis B don't have any known risk factors. Also, screening is not ideal during pregnancy. Also, there's also a suggestion that other family members, like fathers, caregivers, grandparents, who are not routinely screened, they may be able to transmit the virus to their young babies. So that's why this is so important. The next injection given to newborns is for RSV. As Dr. Shah mentioned, mothers, pregnant women can get the vaccine, but babies get something called an immunoglobulin or a monoclonal antibody. So as we discussed, RSV is a respiratory virus, is extremely contagious, and it causes this very serious lung disease in some newborns and infants. So babies whose mothers did not get the vaccine within 2 weeks, they can receive this antibody. This is passive immunity, so it's not really a vaccine per se. So it directly neutralizes the RSV virus and it prevents it from getting into the lungs. Really, I just want to reiterate from the data from 2024, 2025, which is when we started giving this 2 years ago, the rates of hospitalization and even of ER visits has drastically gone down by between 43 and like 50%. So it's really very effective. And there are very few side effects to giving the RSV antibody. Next, I want to talk about a series of vaccines. You can see in the second bullet point that we start giving at age 2 months. So these vaccines are part of a series. They're given either a 4 or 5 dose series, meaning they're given at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, and then again at 12 to 18 months. And additionally, some of them are given at ages 4 to 6. So the first one is polio. Inactivated polio. Most of you have heard of this, but hopefully have not seen it. This is a virus that spreads person to person. It's through stool, coughing, sneezing, even touching contaminated food or water. Many people who used to get this disease hardly had any symptoms or had like flu-like symptoms. However, about 1 in 150 cases, people would become paralyzed. They would have muscle weakness and they would have permanent paralysis. Additionally, even in rare cases, people would die from the disease as well. It would affect their respiratory muscles. So before the vaccines were available, there were huge outbreaks, especially in the 1950s. And unfortunately, it really affected children more than anybody. But of course, thanks to vaccines, polio has basically been eliminated almost. Unfortunately, when the rates decrease, illness can return, but it's really been wonderful to eliminate it mostly in the United States. Another one of the vaccines I want to talk about for these 2 month shots is part of the vaccines that Dr. Shah alluded to, the DTaP. She mentioned already the pertussis part. I'm going to talk about the diphtheria. So diphtheria is something that it's a bacteria that can cause a really bad sore throat, fever, and a really awful gray membrane that you can see in the back of their throat. It can also cause heart and nerve inflammation too. This also has basically been eliminated in the United States, but again, when where vaccinations are not fully covered, it can return. And then finally, I'm going to talk about tetanus. This is something, we as adults get about every 10 years in terms of the vaccine, not the disease. It's a life-threatening disease and bacteria can enter the body through wounds, right? You step on a dirty nail. It can cause lockjaw, muscle rigidity, and painful muscle spasms, but it can be very severe in young children and infants and cause death actually in up to 20% of infants. Before we had clean ways of protecting babies, it would often go through their umbilical cords. That's how they would get it. And tetanus does not confer natural immunity after the infection, which means you have to vaccinate in order to protect, which is why we have to get vaccinated every 10 years.
Thank you, Dr. Grossman. Very, very informative. From rounding in the hospital, I can tell you that definitely there are more refusals for that birth dose of Hep B. So I think it was very helpful that you provided a description of why it's so important and how, many people who have the infection can be, asymptomatic or have, no real risk factors. So very, very important. I'm going to continue on and I'm going to discuss the next couple of vaccines that are also recommended early on in life. The first one being PCV or Prevnar. Now, this protects against a specific type of strep called strep pneumococcus, and this is a bacteria. Currently, this is actually the leading cause of bacterial meningitis, and meningitis is a serious brain and spinal cord infection. Typically, children who have meningitis often need to be hospitalized in the ICU. There's also permanent sequelae that can occur, including hearing loss, developmental delays. Babies under, especially 2 months of age, are the highest risk. But even throughout the first year of life, there's always a higher risk of this infection. This is a common cause of ear infection, sinus infections, pneumonia, bloodstream infections, and many times, with especially going back to meningitis, I've personally had patients who've had meningitis who have had very difficult hospital stays, who've needed spinal taps. Families go through a lot of stress for something that could be prevented potentially. So very important. And this is also the same kind of sequence, 2, 4, 6 months of age, and then you get a booster typically around like 15 months or 12 to 15 months of age. The next one is Hib or Haemophilus influenza B, and this was actually the previous leading cause of bacterial meningitis. Thankfully, it is not any longer, and this is largely due to the vaccination schedule, which has been adapted in the US. It's known for now a common infection called epiglottitis. Again, not as common anymore, but I don't know if you recall, Dr. Grossman, but at least during my years of training, thankfully, I never had to encounter a case of epiglottitis. And with epiglottitis, children can get swelling in the back of the throat in a small piece of cartilage, which can actually lead to airway obstruction. And all I've heard is stories about how serious this infection can be, and the fact that sometimes children need to be, intubated or have a breathing tube, and this causes a lot of severe complications. These children usually have to be rushed to the ER, and pre-vaccine era, there were about 20,000 cases annually, especially in children under 5 of this infection. And unfortunately, out of these 20,000, up to 1,000 children ended up passing away. Post 1980s, when the vaccination was implemented, there was a 95% decline in the number of Hib-related invasive infections. So we can see that this has made a huge difference in terms of the illness and the criticality of the infection. The next one is rotavirus, and rotavirus can lead to severe watery diarrhea, vomiting, fever, and even dehydration. Again, more common in the 1940s, and in fact was one of the most leading causes of diarrhea-related deaths in children under 5. And unfortunately, there is really no antiviral treatment. So the only defense we have against this infection is really giving that vaccine. We do know that the vaccine has also contributed to a decline in hospitalizations and in mortality. Between 2007 to 2011, studies showed an average decrease of 45,000 rotavirus-related hospitalizations. And this is largely linked to just, widespread vaccine implementation. I don't know if you've seen any cases, Dr. Grossman. I had very few during my training years.
Yes, unfortunately, when I was training in the late 1990s, our hospital floors were filled with kids who had rotavirus. There would be anywhere from 5 to 10 admissions every day from rotavirus. And these kids, they looked really sick. There was a lot of vomiting, diarrhea, and they were really dehydrated. And every once in a while, somebody would end up in the intensive care unit. And it was really scary for these kids. So the rotavirus vaccine has really reduced the number of hospitalizations for these infants. It's really been great.
Yeah. And, when we think about especially the kids who, healthy kids, of course, they have hopefully developing immune systems. But when you think about the children who have compromised immune systems, chronic lung disease, congenital heart problems, asthma, now these children are at even higher risk of getting more sick. So we know that these vaccines from newborn through 6 months of age and onwards, have really, helped improve overall health too. And then we're going to continue on to the next set. So the next slide shows the recommended vaccines from 12 through 24 months. And, the first one, MMR, measles, mumps, rubella. This vaccine requires no introduction with all of the media attention that measles has received with the recent outbreaks in Texas and Kansas. I'm sure everybody has heard of the name. And, these outbreaks this is current information, led up to 100 children being hospitalized with up to 2 deaths. And to date, I just checked, the CDC data this morning, 1491. So 1,491 children affected with the measles currently. And we know that this is a very, very contagious virus, and there are some serious complications that can occur. High fever, severe dehydration, pneumonia, encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain, putting kids at risk for seizures, coma, and even permanent brain damage. And prior to 2000, we were not really seeing many cases. I think it was actually considered eradicated, but over the last 15 to 20 years, we're starting to see more breakthrough cases, and this is because of the lack of vaccinations. Now, when individuals are choosing to not vaccinate their children, they are indirectly putting others at risk. Now, the concept of herd immunity generally works, if everybody gets the vaccine. But when you have little breaks in the vaccine pool, you're going to have a risk of the illnesses coming back as well. Those children who actually unfortunately cannot get the vaccine due to some sort of compromised immune system, now they're at even higher risk due to the several who may not choose to vaccinate. So I can't underscore the importance of this vaccine in particular. And this vaccine also protects against mumps, rubella. Mumps is usually an infection of the salivary glands, which can lead to inflammation of testicles, ovaries, pancreas, brain, and spinal cord. And then rubella, commonly known as the German measles, also can be problematic to the expectant moms, with risks to the newborn with congenital birth defects. And, there have even been reported cases of miscarriage with congenital rubella infections.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shah. Really unsettling, but interesting. So I'm going to talk next about varicella, chickenpox, and hepatitis A. So a really important part of our vaccine schedule, chickenpox. I know people think, well, it's mild. Why do I need to give my child this? Well, unfortunately, you can have very serious complications from chickenpox, pneumonia, encephalitis, secondary infections, bacterial infections, and even death, especially in immunocompromised individuals. As Dr. Shah mentioned, those people are at much higher risk. But prior to starting universal vaccines, there were over 10,000 hospitalizations every year in the United States and over 100 deaths. This is just in the United States alone, every single year. Amazingly, since vaccination began, there's a huge dramatic decrease in the number of hospitalizations, of course, the number of cases, and now there are only maybe 1 or 2 deaths a year in the entire United States. So that's really amazing. Um, and I also want to talk about hepatitis A. This is a different kind of liver disease than hepatitis B, but it's usually acquired through ingesting contaminated food or water. You can get fever, anorexia, nausea, belly pain, and it can lead to jaundice. It can lead to liver failure. But since we've introduced this vaccine in the childhood vaccine schedule, the cases have decreased dramatically by 95 or 97% in the United States alone. So it's really been amazing. I do want to talk a little bit about boosters. So if you see here at the schedule, you can see age. So you got a couple years of break, right? Your kids get their vaccines, and then usually by 2, they're good for a little while, except for those annual flu shots. Then age 4 to 6, they need boosters. They need their boosters. So, what are boosters? They're simply just additional doses of the vaccine. So you need polio, DTaP, MMR, and varicella, and they're given at age 4 to 6, and it's to ensure long-term immunity. It's also to protect the kids that didn't respond well to the first dose. So it's really an ideal time to give because this is when almost all children, right? All children are going to be starting kindergarten, some for the first time, and they're going to be exposed to illnesses, and they're going to have a higher chance of getting new diseases too. So these are really catch-up vaccines. And They immunize those who didn't respond, and they help to boost the immunity in those that did respond. And as Dr. Shaw was talking about herd immunity, what this does on a population level, it really helps to prevent outbreaks. And which, of course, as she said, we're seeing now in some parts of the country with measles. So it's really very important to get those booster doses.
Agreed. And really helpful information because I'm sure you get these questions too, but I get a lot of parents who request to delay vaccines, to space them out, to do them one at a time. Sometimes they're resistant to the boosters. I have many parents who also have lived in other countries and they say, why does our country have so many vaccinations compared to other countries? But, we referred to that chart earlier on in the presentation that really outlines kind of the schedule. And I know we talked a little bit about the boosters and the timing, but it does play a key role in ensuring that children are protected when they're the most vulnerable. And we are also kind of ensuring that they have effective immunity by the time that they actually get to school age. There are two additional vaccines that I just wanted to discuss, and I talked about them in the expectant mom, but now for the children, the influenza vaccine, usually you can start getting it as early as 6 months of life. And infants usually with the first time they get it up until 8 years of age, if it's their first time, they usually need 2 doses and then they get a yearly shot thereafter. And influenza or flu can cause high fevers, dehydration, muscle breakdown, and even respiratory failure. Very important in our children who have asthma or any sort of lung or heart issues. And the reason why the vaccine is recommended yearly because the viral strains we know change seasonally. Sometimes even within the same season, we'll have multiple strains circulating. So this is why that vaccine is actually updated annually to protect against the strains that are most likely to circulate in that fall and winter season. And this can be considered, your official pediatrician reminder to get your flu vaccine at any of our offices. And then to continue, the COVID vaccine. Now, we discussed the importance of the COVID vaccine in the expectant moms, but in children, it can lead to pneumonia, vomiting, dehydration, and even a rare syndrome known as MIS-C or multisystem inflammatory syndrome. And I can tell you that, I've personally taken care of children who had this complication from COVID, and children were in the hospital. Children were requiring ICU stays, more intensive treatment. Especially at the height of the pandemic, there were up to 4.4 million infection-related deaths worldwide. And out of those, 17,400 occurred in children. 47% of these were actually just children and adolescents, and kids under 9. And we know that, the mortality from COVID-19 infection in general exceeded that of many other viruses, which is why the AAP still supports getting that COVID vaccines yearly. And you can also get your COVID vaccine here with Summit Health. Children are eligible as early as 6 months of age, and it's usually the same thing as a flu. So a first time they get it, they'll get the 2 doses, and then it's usually a yearly booster thereafter. And I can tell you from personal experience in the office, kids do well. Kids overall don't get sick as much during the season. So we do know it is effective.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. So what should we expect after the vaccination? Most of you guys know this already. It's probably familiar. You can, of course, have the common side effects, right? Some pain, redness, swelling at the injection site. And then, of course, you can have fever, fussiness, being really tired afterwards. And these really shouldn't last more than 24 hours. What's really important is to do some comfort measures. We do that during and after vaccinating. There's, of course, distraction with toys, music. So many parents now bring out their cell phones. Breastfeeding, of course, is great. And then afterwards, when you get home, in order to comfort kids, infants especially, who have mild side effects, we talk about the 5 S's. So that's swaddling, some side and stomach positioning, shushing, singing, swinging, and sucking. So most of the time, these are very short-lived, and it's very rare to have a severe side effect. Certainly, you can have anaphylactic reactions, allergic reactions, but they're so rare They occur about 1 in 1 million, sometimes 1 in 500,000, depending on which vaccine you're administering. But it's really important to underscore that these are extremely rare, and it's actually much more common to have a severe reaction to the disease itself. For example, measles. As Dr. Shah was talking about, with the case of measles, the risk of actually dying from measles is 1 to 3 in 1,000. And very sadly, that is what we just seen in the past few months. Two healthy children did unfortunately die. So very rare to have a severe reaction, much more common to have a severe reaction, unfortunately, to the disease itself.
And, obtaining approval for vaccines, it's usually a very rigorous and multi-step process. There are many points of regulatory review. This includes research, clinical testing, ongoing safety and monitoring studies. There's going to be a chart on the next slide, which kind of briefly walks you through the full vaccine development process. But there is tremendous effort to ensure that they are safe, effective, and really meet the highest quality standards before they're actually available for the general public. And just to provide an overview, so scientists will develop the concepts for a vaccine depending on how the virus or bacteria causes disease in humans. Then researchers will go on to perform the multi-step trials, which includes intense safety and efficacy studies in lab animals before they're even considered, for testing in human subjects. And then by the time that a vaccine actually reaches phase 3, it's usually tested in thousands and thousands of people. The immune response is assessed, any side effects are identified, and actually data for any sort of like long-term outcomes is obtained too. There are many regulatory agencies, the FDA, the CDC, as well as independent experts that kind of continue ongoing monitoring for the manufacturing process and obtain clinical data. And all of this has to occur before the vaccine actually even comes to the general public. And once it's out there, there's a place where you can report any sort of side effects or outcomes. It's called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And these are agencies that actually collect and analyze the data on the short as well as the long-term side effects. So you can see on the next slide, just the multiple steps. So the multiple phases of the clinical trials, the FDA review, and the ongoing safety monitoring. So it's a very, very regulated process.
Very interesting, Dr. Shah. You can see all the time and money that goes into making sure that these vaccines are safe for our children and ourselves. So now we want to move on to talking about some of the myths and misconceptions about vaccines. But first, I want to say it's sort of very timely to talk about misinformation that's spread on social media. Because, look, as many of you know, misconceptions can spread rapidly in the age of the internet and with social media. There was actually at least one study done, a research study in 2021, specifically about misconceptions about vaccines. It was discovered that 65% of misinformation about vaccines originated from 12 people online. This is how quickly information spreads. These individuals use their anti-vaccine messaging and they gain more users and who then go to their websites. Remember, social media does not filter for accuracy, right? So you could be seeing information because of algorithms and because the information appeals to a lot of people. Content gets promoted by clicks, right? And then perhaps they're shared by influencers or celebrities, not by scientific research. So it's not easy for somebody who's not in the medical or research field to see what is true and what's not. And once you even look at one of these platforms, even once, you'll easily be sent into a whole disinformation rabbit hole without you even realizing it. And unfortunately, when true experts like pediatricians, infectious disease experts, scientists, when we post real scientific content, the algorithm drowns us out. And so we aren't even heard. So, it might say, oh, well, we only got, 50 likes, whereas somebody else got 1.1 million likes. So in our brains, we think, well, then that's who must be the right person, right? Also, don't forget there are commercial interests that play a significant role with these social media algorithms. A lot of anti-vaccine content are linked to sources that are selling alternative health products or a book. So you have to be really careful and very mindful. Anyway, so getting back to the point, common myths. Do vaccines cause autism? No, these claims are completely false. Let me tell you a little bit about this study that came out, okay? This is where it all began. So in 1998, there was one study making a claim linking the MMR vaccine and autism. This study had 12 children, which is, of course, a very, very small sample size for medical studies. The paper was subsequently retracted due to the fact that the authors misrepresented data. The key author, his name is Dr. Andrew Wakefield. He was removed from the UK medical registration. His license was taken away. He's not even a full pediatrician. He's actually a gastroenterologist. In the paper, they retracted it because they falsified data and there were ethical violations. And there was even involvement of paying lawyers who were involved in vaccine lawsuits. And that is the origin of this paper. Unfortunately, this paper, for some reason, received broad media coverage, and it was falsely linking autism and the MMR vaccine. And it led to widespread concern that has lasted years and years. So, what did the scientific community do between 2002 and 2021? There have been at least 12 huge studies involving over 1 million children throughout the world, and they have shown there is no association between getting the MMR vaccine and the risk of autism. Part of the problem is that people become concerned because the diagnosis of autism is given at about the same age that the MMR vaccine is also given. So parents become concerned that it's the vaccine causing the condition and not realizing that this is when, unfortunately, children do present with the disease. Next myth, vaccines contain dangerous ingredients. So modern vaccines are extremely safe and the ingredients are very safe. There are some components that are in the vaccines that sound scary, but these are something they're either naturally in the body, they're in the environment, they're in the food we eat. So what are these things that people talk about all the time? We hear it at every visit when somebody has vaccine concerns. Aluminum, mercury, and formaldehyde. So let me just address each of these. So first of all, mercury. Parents are concerned about this. A type of mercury called thimerosal used to be in some vaccines. So why was it there to begin with? It is a preservative and it is used to stop the growth of bacteria and fungi in multi-unit vaccines. Thimerosal is actually, it's a type of mercury called ethyl mercury, which is very different from the toxic mercury called methyl mercury, which is found in some fish like tuna, which can be harmful to the brain in large quantities, right? Pregnant women aren't supposed to eat very much tuna. However, ethyl mercury, the body efficiently processes it and they can clear it. And that is, so it doesn't accumulate in our bodies. However, to appease the public, this mercury, thimerosal, was removed from every single childhood vaccine by 2001. Except there were a few multi-dose influenza vaccine formulations that it still does exist to, but children do not get that. However, multiple large-scale studies show there's no connection between mercury and autism. In fact, the rate of autism diagnosed after 2001, unfortunately, after the thimerosal was removed, was still going up. So one of the other ingredients, aluminum. Is it in vaccines? Yes, a very, very small amount is in vaccines. However, aluminum is part of our earth. Um, Infants, all of us have tiny amounts of aluminum that we are exposed to every day. Infants are exposed in breast milk and formula. In fact, if you look at the amount of aluminum in the diet, an infant is exposed to about 3 to 84 milligrams of aluminum in their diet in the first year of life, while the exposure from a vaccine is maybe 4 to 5 milligrams total. So it's a lot less. Well, why is it put there to begin with? It actually also functions as something called an adjuvant, which helps the immune system build a stronger, longer lasting response. And you can get fewer doses of vaccine. So it is important, but you're getting a tiny, tiny amount, and we have it anyway. The other, we're ingesting it anyway. Formaldehyde. So this is actually a naturally occurring chemical in our own bodies. It's actually produced by the human body, and it helps us to perform various functions. The amount that's present in a vaccine is much, much lower than what you actually get in our body. In fact, it's thousands of times lower than what we produce naturally. So, why is it used to begin with? Again, it's used to inactivate viruses and detoxify bacteria so that the vaccines stay safe. So they're getting tiny, tiny amounts in the vaccine.
Really useful, Dr. Grossman. Thank you. And one of the next myths is it better to wait until children are older to vaccinate them? Now, I get this question in the office a lot about people wanting to start vaccines after one, or wanting to space out some of the boosters, or wanting to split the actual vaccine series. And what I try to kind of educate and counsel my parents about is that delaying these vaccines actually leaves the kids the most vulnerable, actually, at the time where they're at the highest risk of having severe complications from some of the preventable diseases that we talked about, pertussis, polio, rotavirus. And the recommended immunization schedule really provides that timed protection. Their immune systems, like you said before, are just not fully developed yet. And thus, this is why most pediatricians will recommend against delaying vaccines or spacing them out. We don't want our children to get the whooping cough or measles or even flu and end up in the hospital. And that exposure is unavoidable. Children are, going to other homes, cousins, going to the park, gatherings and things like that. And there's going to be a risk of contracting a virus or bacteria really from anywhere. And delaying these vaccines just puts them at greater harm, and just not having enough defense to combat some of these serious illnesses. And this is maybe a little bit more of a far-reaching analogy, but if you think about all of the other commercial things that we buy, life insurance, car insurance, renter's insurance, travel insurance, this is all really to keep us safe, right? And to prevent harm from occurring. But in the same way, when it comes to protecting our children to ensure that they don't get sick from some of these horrible illnesses, we just have to kind of stop and think, what is it that we are afraid of? And why is it that we don't necessarily want to protect our children in the time that they need the most protection? Again, to kind of just drive that point home, herd immunity, again, refusing vaccines will create little holes, and the children that do get exposed and infected, there's going to be a risk of transmitting that infection to other children as well. Again, bringing back some of those outbreaks as well. And we can see that firsthand with what's going on with the measles and even pertussis in certain regions. And for the second myth, so the second myth says diseases were already going away before vaccines because of better nutrition and hygiene. And certainly in the 19th and 20th century, some of these infectious diseases were better controlled due to some of these improvements, such as sanitation, clean water, pest control, pasteurized milk. However, there was a more dramatic reduction in the disease incidence once larger groups of children were actually vaccinated.
So moving on with other myths, only one vaccine should be administered at a time. So again, false. There have been extensive clinical studies showing that we can give, multiple vaccines and that they're safe and effective. There's no risk of adverse events compared to giving them separately. If you think about a child at a playground or even holding, leaning against you, we all have thousands of antigens on us. They're in our environment everywhere. So delaying or spacing out the vaccines, all you're doing is increasing the risk of acquiring the actual disease. And you're going to have more medical visits. As much as we want to see all of you, we would like to try to minimize the number of times that you guys come in. The next myth here, natural infection builds stronger immunity. As we discussed, it's much safer to actually get the vaccine than it is to actually get the true infection. And again, we talked about this. Is it safer to delay or separate the vaccines? No, it's not. The schedule is designed to protect babies when they're the most vulnerable. And in terms of the final one that we have here, there are too many vaccines on the schedule. Well, although the number of vaccines has increased, the actual number of immunologic components has declined. The smallpox vaccine actually had 200 proteins, where 14 of the recommended vaccines in the US contain 160 components. So it's really gone down. I know it doesn't seem that way, but we're actually exposing your kids to fewer and fewer components. So there really are not too many vaccines on the schedule.
Thank you, Dr. Grossman. Very, very helpful. And many of the common questions that we get in the office every day. I know these conversations are also being had amongst parents, amongst social media groups. So, really, really helpful to break it down in this way. So, really in light of a time where accessibility to information just has increased overall, we have to ensure that as parents and as providers, we're obtaining accurate and evidence-based information to guide us in our daily decision making. And we're hoping that this presentation really allows you to better understand the childhood vaccination schedule and their undeniable benefits with illness prevention.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. Yeah, that was very helpful. I also want to leave you with another real world analogy, like you use the insurance analogy. I would like you to think of giving vaccines as an analogy to wearing a seatbelt in a car. They're both preventative. Neither guarantees you won't get sick or that you won't have an injury, but they reduce the chance of serious illness and of course, death. They also contribute to the community or herd immunity, making the disease more difficult to spread to vulnerable people in the community. Just like wearing a seatbelt, which can protect other people in the car with you. However, they do not eliminate every single risk. Just like a seatbelt can cause minor injuries, but the benefits absolutely outweigh the risk. Finally, they both require advanced action where you need to vaccinate before you're exposed to the disease, like putting a seatbelt on before you get into a car, before the accident occurs.
And this is one of the last slides that just kind of outlines, some of the evidence-based resources that you can access online. If you have questions about vaccines, ingredients, side effects, and safety, I really highly encourage you to avoid accessing social media platforms because, as Dr. Grossman mentioned, many of that information is targeted. It's sponsored content. It doesn't always have your child's best interest in mind. And then, if you have any questions, you can always go to your trusted general pediatrician as well.
Okay, great. So time for another poll. How are you feeling right now when it comes to vaccines and pediatric options with Summit Health? Excellent. Great. Well, we want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. If you want to revisit this conversation or share this with a loved one or a friend, we will be sharing a recording of today's webinar in the coming days, and we really appreciate you being with us this evening.